Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 3/4 of a percentage point. That's the biggest hike since 1994. Then the Bank of England and the Swiss National Bank raised their own rates. As we enter a period of high interest rates around the globe, will it help tame inflation? Joining me now is Rana, CNN's global economic analyst and global business columnist for the Financial Times. She has a new book out. It's called Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Rana, welcome. First, let me ask you, what do you think is the crux of the inflation we've gotten? Because for many, many years, people predicted that there'd be inflation. Most famously, after the crisis, the global financial crisis, they said, "Don't do quantitative easing. It'll cause inflation." This time around, Larry Summers said, to do all this quantitative easing and to have done these big COVID stimulus packages and to do another one under Biden was just going to be too much, and it was going to trigger inflation. He did seem to get the timing right. What do you think is behind this inflation?
So I think that there are two things happening. The first thing is in the real world, and that's COVID and the war in Ukraine. You know, we started to see throughout the pandemic supply chains breaking down, the world becoming much more regional in some ways, local in some ways. That's inflationary. You know, when you add sort of time and stress to the system, you get inflationary pressures. At the same time, you then have the war in Ukraine. This is, taking Russian energy out of the global market, which is an immediate, huge deal for energy inflation. But it's also taking Ukrainian wheat, Ukrainian grain, and this is one of the key bread baskets of the world, off the global market, or directing it in some cases with food piracy into places where it's not about market forces. So you immediately get those things colliding to produce real world inflation. Now, I would go back and say that the second factor is not just the quantitative easing we've seen since the financial crisis, which was huge. I mean, really unprecedented. And I think, by the way, that the first couple of rounds of that were necessary, but that you could say that round 3, round 4 were really just adding too much fuel to the fire. But this reflects a deeper point, which is that for decades now, politicians of both stripes have really passed the ball to the Fed. So even before the financial crisis, you would see politicians really encouraging the Fed to keep rates low, the Fed sort of stretching out the business cycle. This is nothing nefarious. Central bankers are trying to do what they need to do, which is create price stability, keep unemployment low, keep prices stable. But the problem is they have limited tools. They can only really inflate asset prices. They can't change the real story on the ground for business. So in lieu of fiscal policy, you get this sort of what I would call a kind of a financialized growth over the last 40 years, is saccharine growth, where asset prices are rising, but real incomes aren't changing, since the mid-1990s. So those two things, the real pressures of today, war and pandemic, start to collide with the financialization of certainly the last 15 years, if not the last 40.
I want to pick up on what you were saying at the end there, because it seems to me a very powerful and slightly depressing point, which is that the American political system has been so broken, really for decades now, that Congress can almost never actually do what it's meant to do, which is to spend money during a recession to maybe pare back in boom times. And instead, Congress stays deadlocked. All the responsibility for managing the economy goes to the Fed. And as you say, the Fed can only do one thing, which is lower interest rates in these crises, which does help the economy, but disproportionately helps rich people, people who own assets, exacerbating inequality and creating the sugar high. Is there any prospect that the infrastructure bill that Biden is doing, are we witnessing a bit of a turn in that?
I think we are starting to see at the margins some things being done. COVID really was like a scrim that was raised on all these problems in the real economy. And one of them is the fact that along with that financialization that I talked about, you've seen a concentration of power. You have very, very highly concentrated global supply chains, which are meant to be efficient. But as we've seen, they break down. Their resiliency is not strong in crisis. So that has the administration, for example, looking at antitrust issues in areas like food in technology. You're also starting to see, not just in the U.S., but in Europe and in Asia, more regionalization of supply chains and regional sourcing. So the idea of getting past some funding for a CHIPS bill, and really supporting what companies say like Intel are starting to do, putting a new foundry in America to create semiconductor chips for the first time in half a century. I think that these are vectoral changes, and it's going to be slow and steady, but I don't think that we're going to see the world going back to the mid-1990s. The world is not flat, it's bumpy. I think it's going to get bumpier for a while. It will be inflationary, but I think ultimately we're going to come out to a more balanced place where production and consumption is going to be a little more closely hubbed, not just in the U.S., but in Europe and Asia.
Finally, I got to ask you, for most people, their single biggest asset is their house. Do you think that this collapse in the stock market is going to be followed by a collapse in the housing market? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Two things happening in the housing market. Again, one real, one financial. Certainly low rates, some of that monetary stimulus that you saw following COVID helped, right? Low rates encourage buying. You're trying to push people into the market, but that's only about a third of what's going on. If you look at mortgage rates, we're not back in 2008. You're not seeing a ton of bad lending going on. The pandemic was an incredible shift in the American housing market. You suddenly could work 2 or 3 hours away from the cities that you might have lived in. A lot of people moved from expensive coastal cities to the south and to the west. And so in some ways, that's a real structural shift that is still playing out. It might be more like the adoption of the automobile in the post-World War II period, which allowed people to travel in new ways. It created the suburbs. It pushed people out to California. I think that some of those shifts are going to last for another year, 2 years, maybe 5 years. And so you won't see the sort of collapse in the housing market that you might see in asset markets, except in very, very frothy areas.
Rana, Forooha, always so smart to talk to you. Thank you so much. Next on GPS, Biden goes to Saudi Arabia. We're going to ask what he will do there.